Sailboats racing on Lake Ontario. The westerly winds of the Great Lakes have been driving our sailing craft since the first settlers hauled canvas aloft. This is the story of the shipwrights of Oakville and the craft that made Oakville world famous. In the 19th century, swift trading schooners were their forte. In the 20th century, the sleek racing yacht has become an Oakville specialty. Unlike pleasure boaters of the last few decades, sailors haven't always sailed for fun. Nor did the winds always blow, and when they did, they weren't always peaceful. Heavy naval losses and Napoleon's blockade of the Baltic ports caused Britain to look westward for the timber needed to replace her ships of the line. First, Atlantic Canada supplied the timbers for the British Navy. When these timbers were not enough, Southern Ontario's lush forest yielded the tall, straight white pines for the mast and the stout oak for the hulls. The Royal Navy had its new ships, and Southern Ontario's shipbuilding tradition was born on the winds of a war an ocean away. In the peace that followed, new lakeside settlements appeared. Among them, at the mouth of 16 Mile Creek, was what we now call Oakville. The prevailing winds at the beginning of this peace were the winds of wealth and opportunity. The Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, once opened up for navigation, flourished. John Simpson founded his shipyard on the banks of the 16, where he built schooners for the expanding trade. His work laid the foundation for Oakville's future reputation.
For a 50-ton shipping schooner, and if you could sign here, please.
Throughout the woods surrounding the Great Lakes, the once silent forest now echoed with the sounds of the timber harvest. Wherever timber could be floated downstream to sheltered harbors near the lakeshore, trading schooners were built. First, the logs were sawed into planks, and then trimmed and sectioned according to the size and natural curves, if they are destined to be used as some key skeletal component. Skilled carpenters and laborers worked with shipwrights to select the timbers, shaping them into the keels, ribs, stern and stem post, the very framework of the ships. Their tools consisted of saws, adzes, awls, augers, hammers, chisels, block and tackle. A steam box is used to shape a plank, which is then nailed into place across the ribs, helping to form the hull. Hemp caulking is hammered in to fill the spaces between the planks, and then the whole is tarred to render the hull watertight. Deck planks are laid, and then the blacksmiths take over, heating the metal to red hot, shaping the metal strappings and fittings which will anchor the rigging. Finally, the finished hull is ready. and the chocks are knocked away, allowing the hull to slide sideways into the creek in preparation for final fitting up and loading. Crew members paint the bow of their schooner. Here, a rigger finishes whipping the end of a halyard. In the sail lofts, the sailmakers cut, trim, and sew the heavy canvas which will drive the ships. As more schooners were built and unfurled their sails to meet the demand, Oakville became home to other shipyards, as well as a very busy port. In the mid-1800s, trade on the Great Lakes expanded again, resulting in a significant boom in the shipbuilding industry. The lumber trade was enormous and seemingly supplies endless. Lumber through Chicago to the U.S. Midwest, and grain back to the east. Lumber and grain eastward down Lake Ontario and down the St. Lawrence to Oswego, New York, and to Quebec for shipment across the Atlantic. On their return, these lake schooners played their part in our history, bringing from Quebec trade goods and new immigrant settlers. And from Oswego, they were the last connecting link on the Underground Railroad to freedom for the escaping slaves. The schooners were built for practical purposes, narrow of beam and blunt of bow. Their prime design consideration was to get the greatest cargo volume possible into vessels which fit the early locks and canals of the system. The hulls and sail area grew, but the crews didn't grow that much. Most had crews of 6, but in some instances, as few as 3 men would handle all the watches as well as the acres of sails aloft. In the late 1800s, alongside the big schooners in the lumber ports, there appeared a new generation of boats which did not rely on the wind. The first steam-powered ships had arrived. For the era of sail, these first steamboats sounded the death knell. As schooners like the White Oak started to age, there was to be no refitting. The White Oak's fate was sealed. Today, she lies in a few feet of water where she was abandoned, here in Collins Inlet. Today, the same dock at Collins Inlet on Georgian Bay is just a line of rotted out pilings, one more hazard for modern mariners. Now, like so many other once proud sailing vessels of her era, John Simpson's majestic Sweepstakes is just one more hidden, decaying reminder of our trading past. Another era had ended. But the wind still blew. Now the challenge was a new one, and a new breed of men were to answer it. Men like Captain James Andrews. Andrews established his yard on the 16. An experienced schooner captain himself, Andrews was able to read the new wind and to chart a new course. He anticipated and catered to a new market, the wealthy, who could afford to sail for pleasure. The design and construction of pleasure yachts of the era is clearly different from that of the lake schooners which preceded them, although many principles remained the same. Deep lead keels were bolted to the bottom of the hulls to balance the heeling movement of the wind in the sails. Otherwise, although the timbers were relatively delicate and of necessity closer together, the building techniques were similar. In the year 1896, Chicago's Lincoln Park Yacht Club challenged the Royal Canadian Yacht Club to produce a boat to compete for a trophy to be named after the first boat to win it. James Andrews labored to build a boat to win that trophy. It was a race against time. Prior to issuing the challenge, the American Yacht Club had already built their boat. From the laying of the first timber to her first race, the boat took less than 3 months to build. The boat was named Canada. The trophy was named the Canada's Cup. An old rivalry had been rekindled. Since that first race series in 1896, the yacht clubs on either side of the border have been putting forward their best to race for the Canada's Cup on a regular basis. Of the 17 Canadian Defenders and Challengers, 10 have been built by Oakville boatyards. Oakville yacht builders started construction of one very notable craft, the Quest. Quest challenged for the Canada's Cup only to lose to the American yacht Thisbe. Despite that, she was to go on to race with enormous success over half a century. Quest and Thisbe both have survived into the modern era. In the years following the Second World War, dramatic changes have taken place in the realm of yacht building. The centuries-old method of plank and rib construction has been surpassed by modern technologies. Aluminum, steel wire, and fiberglass have revolutionized the design and manufacturing of sailing craft. The catboat is a rugged boat whose broad beam and unstayed mast step far forward through the foredeck, and the large single sail render it easily single-handed and very seaworthy.
The non-such design is based aesthetically on the traditional Cape Cod catboats, which flourished in New England in the mid-19th century. With advances in materials, aluminum, fiberglass, stainless steel, and Dacron, we've been able to achieve a lighter structure which performs better than the original catboat designs.
Red Jacket's unveiling in 1966 was an example of these materials creating new opportunities for designers like George Cuthbertson.
October 65, Maple Leaf Gardens, between the second and the third periods, Perry Conley suggested that he'd like to have the meanest, hungriest 40-footer that we could think up. So we went to work on Red Jacket, and she was launched the next spring, 66.
Red Jacket went on to win the Southern Ocean Racing Circuit in 1968, on her way to an extremely impressive record, which included 2 consecutive Lipton Cups, as well as strings of victories throughout the Great Lakes, Florida, and the Caribbean. Red Jacket's design, considered at the time to be radical, was possible only through the use of fiberglass hull construction. This revolutionary design brought international renown to George Cuthbertson and established C&C Yachts as a world-class yacht manufacturer. The lower cost and relative simplicity of fiberglass has allowed designers and builders to now produce sailboats for thousands of people who would otherwise still be shorebound. The construction technique, by comparison with wood, allows for the mass production of a large number of identical hulls in a very short period of time.
A wooden boat is built from the inside out, and the finishing coat is put on last. Glass boats, the finish is put in first and it's built from the outside in.
The fiberglass construction technique is very simple. The smooth surface of the mold is polished with wax. Then the desired color of gel coat is sprayed into the mold and allowed to dry. Layers of pre-cut fiberglass sheets are laid in place. Resin, mixed with the required volume of hardener, is poured on top and then brushed and rolled flat to eliminate any air bubbles or pockets, until the desired thickness and strength is reached. This is then allowed to harden and set, and when sufficiently cured, the hull is cracked from the mold, trimmed, and then prepared to be joined to the other molded segment. Despite some of the practical changes wrought by our newer materials and skills, nothing can replace the rich warmth of wood trim. The tools may have changed, but the skills are still in use. Once the interior of the hull has been finished, the deck is lowered to the hull and bonded in place. Here, molten lead is poured into a keel mold and kept hot long enough to allow all the air pockets to escape, and subsequently allowed to cool and set in shape before being broken out. Finally, the keel is hydraulically raised to meet the hull, settling snugly under the bolts, which are tightened into place. Deck fittings are placed onto beds of caulking and tightened into a watertight union. Stainless steel wire and fittings have replaced the heavy ropes of yesterday. Aluminum masts have replaced the tall white pines. Finally, the hull is given a last polishing in preparation for delivery to a customer.
So not only did materials influence the marketing of the product, but they also influenced the design and I suppose, what could be achieved.
The biggest change has been the fact that we can build the same size of boat now for probably much less than half the weight, maybe a quarter of the weight. As a result, boats sort of float on top of the water instead of plowing through the water.
In the continuing quest to create faster, lighter, and stronger craft, new materials are constantly being developed for construction. Vessels such as the Amazing Grace are only possible because of new materials such as Kevlar and carbon fiber. These materials have allowed greater freedom of imagination to designers. Hull shapes, which several years ago would have taken days to design, are now produced in minutes by designer Rob Ball and the computer-aided design system.
It's a system to allow the designer to create three-dimensional shapes. I've used it on 4 of the boats that we've done molds for now and a couple of custom boats. and it allows you to come up with a different hull shape about every 15 minutes instead of every 15 days as we used to do in the olden days.
Yachts built in Oakville have participated in races throughout the world. On the Atlantic, Amazing Grace, another CNC custom design, took part in the daunting Admiral's Cup. On the Pacific, at the Etchells 22 World Championship in Newport Beach, California, 40 of the 65 competing boats were built by the Newman's Ontario Yachts. Oakville's yacht builders continue to plan for the future.
The controls, the inhibitions of the past have been swept away, and we're going to see quantum improvement in the performance of the competing yachts in all respects, in the materials of which they're built, in their equipment, in the techniques of sailing them, and this is going to spin off all through the entire yachting scene to the benefit of all.
I suppose if we wanted to nail it down to a personal philosophy, it's to satisfy a customer's need at the same time producing a yacht, per se, that is going to stay in production for a good many years and satisfy the customer's needs.
Ultimate goal would be to make a boat easier to sail without taking away from its performance. The lighter, the stronger, the better.
I think we've now developed yacht design to the point where it's the fine detail, small things that are making the difference.
The 16-mile creek was once lined with huge stacks of lumber, granaries, shipyards, and schooners lying at the docks awaiting loading. Today, Oakville is home to marinas, yacht clubs, and some of the finest boat builders in the world. Where once dense forests formed a dark cover over the land, today a few white pines stand sentinel, solitary reminders of our history and of the changing times. Oakville's boat building tradition is a rich one. It shows no signs of ending.